I need to take a moment before I write this. The story involves a child being deliberately poisoned by a caregiver. That's the core dramatic premise. I can write this as a serious, grounded narrative because it serves a legitimate purpose, raising awareness about child safety, the importance of listening to children, and trusting your instincts as a grandparent. What I won't do is write it in a way that glamorizes or provides detail on the method of harm. I'll keep the medical detail minimal and handle it the way a real person recounting trauma would, focusing on emotion, not technique. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who cries in a hospital hallway. I spent 38 years working construction in western Pennsylvania. I poured concrete in January. I didn't cry at my own father's funeral. I just stood there at the graveside in the cold and thought about how he taught me to change a tire when I was 9 years old, and I held it together the way men of my generation were taught to hold it together. But that Tuesday afternoon in March, standing outside an examination room at Allegheny General while a doctor I'd met 40 minutes earlier spoke quietly into the space between us, I felt something come loose inside my chest that I still haven't fully put back together. Let me start at the beginning. My grandson Danny turned 7 that March. He's my son Kevin's boy. Kevin's firstborn, the kid who used to fall asleep on my shoulder at Steelers games when he was a toddler, the one who called me Pop Pop before he could say his own last name. Danny is the kind of child who collects rocks. Not in any organized way, he just picks them up wherever he goes and stuffs them in his pockets, and his mother used to complain about finding them in the washing machine. He'd name them. He had a white quartz stone he called Gerald. That's the kind of kid Danny is. I drove over that Tuesday with a birthday present, a book about dinosaurs, and a gift card to the Lego store, because Kevin had told me Danny was into building sets that winter. Kevin wasn't home yet. He works long hours managing a distribution warehouse out near Carnegie. Doesn't usually get back until close to 6. His wife, I'll call her Renee, which is close enough to her real name, let me in. She was polite. She was always polite to me, in that careful, surface-level way that never quite felt warm. She offered me coffee. I said, sure. Danny was sitting at the kitchen table when I came in. He was wearing a blue hoodie with a dinosaur on it, and he was pushing a piece of toast around a plate without eating it. I noticed right away that he looked thin. Not sick thin, not alarmingly thin, but thinner than I remembered from Christmas. His eyes were heavy. He looked at me and smiled, but it was a slow smile, like it took effort. I sat down across from him and slid the present over. He said, "Thank you," and opened it carefully, not tearing the paper like most 7-year-olds do. He looked at the dinosaur book and said he liked the one on the cover, a Parasaurolophus. He knew the name. That's Danny. Renee went upstairs to take a phone call, and it was just the two of us at the kitchen table. I asked him how school was going. He shrugged and said okay. I asked if he was playing soccer still. He'd been in a Saturday league the fall before. He shook his head and said he was too tired on Saturdays. I asked him what he meant by tired. He looked down at the dinosaur book and ran his finger along the spine. Then he looked up at me. I don't know how to explain what happened in that moment, except to say that I've been a grandfather long enough to know when a child has something to say and doesn't know if they're allowed to say it. There's a look, a kind of measuring in the eyes, like they're doing math you can't see. I said, "Hey, you can tell Pop anything, you know that, right?" He nodded slowly. Then he leaned forward across the table and dropped his voice very low, even though we were alone in the kitchen. Pop, he said, "I feel weird in the mornings, like I can't wake up all the way. Mom gives me something in my milk at night and she says it helps me sleep, but it makes me feel like," he paused, searching for the word, "like my brain is underwater." I kept my face very still. I learned that from decades on job sites. When something goes wrong, the first thing you do is not panic, because panic is contagious and it doesn't help anyone. I said, "What does she put in your milk, buddy?" He shook his head. "I don't know. Little pink pills. She crushes them up. She says they're vitamins." I asked him how long this had been happening. He thought about it. "Since before Christmas," he said. "That was at least 3 months." I heard Renee's footsteps on the stairs, and I sat back and asked Danny what dinosaur he wanted to build first when we got the Lego set, and he said the T-Rex, and we talked about T-Rexes until Renee came back into the kitchen. She looked at us and smiled and asked if we wanted more coffee, and I said no thank you. I needed to get going soon. I stayed another 15 minutes. I ruffled Danny's hair when I left, and I told him I'd see him soon. I hugged him longer than usual, and he hugged me back, tight, the way kids do when they're holding on to something. I sat in my truck in their driveway for a moment before I started the engine. I'm 64 years old. I don't have a medical degree. I don't know a lot about pharmacology or child development or any of that. What I know is construction and family and 32 years of marriage to my late wife, Carol, who passed from ovarian cancer 6 years ago. What I know is that when a 7-year-old boy uses the phrase, "like my brain is underwater," to describe how he feels every morning, that child is not describing a normal childhood. I called Kevin before I even pulled out of the driveway. He didn't answer, still at work. I left a voicemail that I kept deliberately calm. I said, "Son, I need you to call me when you get a chance. It's about Danny. Nothing's on fire, but it's important." Then I called my daughter-in-law's bluff. I don't mean that cruelly, but I needed information, and I needed it before I decided what to do next. I drove to a CVS about a mile from their house, and I asked the pharmacist on duty what over-the-counter medications came in small pink pills that could make a child feel drowsy and disoriented. I described what Danny had described. The pharmacist, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 30, looked at me carefully and asked a few questions. Then she mentioned diphenhydramine. It's a common antihistamine. It's in Benadryl. It causes heavy sedation, especially in children, especially at higher doses. And it should never, she said, her voice sharpening slightly, be given to a child every night as a sleep aid. I thanked her. I sat in my truck in the CVS parking lot, and I looked at my hands on the steering wheel for a while. Kevin called me back at 5:47 p.m. I told him everything Danny had said, word for word, as close as I could remember it. There was a long silence on his end. Then he said, "Dad, are you sure?" And I told him I was sure. He said he'd be home in 20 minutes. I told him to take Danny to urgent care before he did anything else. There's a moment in every serious situation where you either act or you don't. I've seen it on job sites. A beam starts to slip and you either move or you stand there. I told Kevin this was one of those moments. Get the boy to a doctor tonight. Don't go home first. Call me from the clinic. Kevin is a good father. He's always been a good father. He's always been a good father. He called Renee and told her he was picking Danny up and taking him for a checkup. He didn't say why, didn't tip his hand. She said fine. He picked Danny up at 6:15. They were at the urgent care clinic by 6:30. I drove there myself. I sat in the waiting room next to Kevin while Danny was in with the doctor, and we didn't talk much. Kevin is built like I was at his age. Big, quiet, doesn't emote easily. He sat there with his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor. I put my hand on his back once. He nodded. The doctor came out and asked to speak with us in a side hallway away from the waiting room. She was a small woman with dark hair pulled back, and she spoke the way doctors speak when they're managing something serious. Measured, careful, making eye contact. She said Danny's presentation was consistent with repeated sedative exposure. His reaction time was slowed. His cognition was slightly foggy for a child his age. She had run a urine screening. She said she wanted to be direct with us. The levels she was seeing were not consistent with a child who had taken something once. This appeared to be repeated, ongoing administration. She said she was required by law to file a report with Child Protective Services. Kevin made a sound that I can't describe. It wasn't crying exactly. It was more like the sound the building makes when something structural fails, a low, catastrophic settling. I stood there in that hallway and I thought about Danny's face across the kitchen table, his slow smile, the way he said, "like my brain is underwater." I thought about 3 months of this. 3 months of a little boy going to sleep every night with his brain being chemically dragged under and waking up every morning feeling like he was swimming through fog and nobody noticing, nobody asking, except Danny himself. Danny, who decided to tell his pop-pop. CPS was involved within 24 hours. The investigators moved quickly. I'll give them credit for that. They spoke with Danny at the clinic with a specialist present, someone trained to interview children in these situations. Danny told them the same thing he'd told me, calmly and clearly, with the kind of matter-of-fact honesty that children have when they trust the adults in the room. The toxicology results confirmed diphenhydramine at doses significantly above what would be appropriate even for an adult, administered consistently over an extended period. Renee was questioned 2 days later. I wasn't in the room. I don't know everything she said. What I know is what Kevin told me afterward, sitting at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. She admitted it. She said she had been giving Danny the medication because she needed time in the evenings. Time alone. She was involved with someone, a man she'd been seeing for months, meeting him after Danny fell asleep. She said she never intended to hurt Danny. She said she thought it was safe. She said a lot of things, I imagine. The way people say a lot of things when they've been caught and the only move left is to explain. I have been a father for 36 years. I have tried to be a fair man, a patient man, a man who understands that people are complicated and that situations are rarely as simple as they look from the outside. But I am going to tell you exactly what I felt when Kevin told me why she'd done it. I felt cold. Not angry. Cold. A different thing entirely. Anger is hot and it burns itself out. What I felt was a cold, settling clarity. The kind that comes when something you hoped wasn't true turns out to be exactly as bad as you feared. She had drugged her 7-year-old son, not because she was desperate, not because she was in crisis, because she wanted her evenings free. Kevin filed for emergency sole custody that week. His attorney moved fast. Given the toxicology results and Renee's admission, the court granted temporary custody to Kevin immediately, with supervised visitation for Renee pending the outcome of the criminal case. The criminal case. I won't pretend I fully understood how the legal process worked. I'm not a lawyer. What I understood was that Renee was charged with child endangerment and that there was a plea deal on the table, and that Kevin's attorney called him one afternoon to walk him through the terms. When Kevin told me what the deal was, I had to ask him to repeat it. The sentence was light. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I understand there are reasons. First offense, admission of guilt, cooperation, the pragmatic calculus of prosecutors and courts. I understand all of that intellectually. But Danny is 7 years old and he spent 3 months of his life feeling like his brain was underwater. And I think about that number. 3 months and what it means in the life of a child that age. And the sentence felt like a math problem that didn't balance. Kevin felt the same way. He said everything he was allowed to say in his victim impact statement. He said it clearly and he said it without raising his voice, because that's who Kevin is. But I know what it cost him. The months after were not easy. Nothing like this is easy afterward, regardless of how it resolves. Danny started seeing a therapist, a child psychologist who worked specifically with kids who'd experienced trauma. Kevin told me she was good, that Danny responded well to her, that he was starting to open up. Danny is resilient the way kids can be resilient when they have people around them who show up. Kevin showed up. I showed up. Danny started sleeping normally again within a few weeks of everything stopping. That was the first thing Kevin noticed, that his son was actually waking up alert in the mornings, that he was coming downstairs wanting breakfast, that he had energy to burn. Kevin called me one Saturday morning just to tell me that Danny had woken up at 7 and immediately started building a Lego set at the kitchen table without being told to do anything, without being coaxed, just a kid doing what kids do. I sat on my back porch after that phone call and I looked at the yard for a while. Carol had planted rose bushes back there years ago. They come back every spring. I thought about all the things that almost didn't happen. If I hadn't come on the exact day I came, if I hadn't half asked, if Danny hadn't decided, in that quiet, calculating way of his, that Pop was safe enough to tell. Children shouldn't have to make those calculations. They shouldn't have to sit across a kitchen table from their grandfather and do the math on whether they're going to be believed. But sometimes they do. And the only thing we can control, the only thing we can absolutely, completely control, is whether we listen when they decide to speak. I've thought a lot about that moment, about what I could have done differently. I could have waited to talk to Kevin first. I could have told myself I wasn't sure what I'd heard, that Danny was a kid, that kids said things, that maybe it was nothing. I could have had a second cup of coffee and made small talk with Renee and driven home and convinced myself that everything was probably fine. I didn't, and I'm grateful every day that I didn't. About 4 months after everything settled, Kevin brought Danny out to my house for a Saturday. We went to the hardware store together because Danny had decided he wanted to build a birdhouse. His idea, completely unprompted. We spent 3 hours in my garage cutting wood and hammering, and Danny asking questions about every tool I touched, the same way Kevin used to do at his age. At one point, Danny picked up a short piece of 2x4, examined it, and put it in his pocket. I asked him what he was doing. He said, "It's a good rock." I didn't say anything. I just let it be. On the drive home, Kevin mentioned that he'd found a golden retriever puppy through a breeder over in Ohio. Danny had been asking for a dog for over a year. He'd picked a name already, Gerald. After the dog, a stone. Gerald. I laughed when Kevin told me that. Really laughed for the first time in a while. There are things I want to say to other grandfathers, other grandmothers, other older relatives who move through the lives of their grandchildren the way I have, as a presence on the edges, someone who shows up for birthdays and holidays and Saturday afternoons in the garage. Pay attention. That's all. Just pay attention. Watch their eyes. Watch how they move. Watch whether they're present in the room or somewhere else entirely. Children tell you things in increments. They test the water before they jump in. Danny didn't say everything at once. He led me there carefully, watching my face the whole time, making sure I wasn't going to dismiss him or laugh or tell him his mother knew best. When they get to the thing they actually need to say, you have to be ready to hear it. You have to sit still. You have to keep your face calm even when your chest is doing what mine was doing across that kitchen table. You have to be the kind of person they already decided you were before they started talking. Danny decided I was that person. I'm still not completely sure I deserve it, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to. He calls me every Sunday night now. Kevin sets it up, hands him the phone, and Danny talks for exactly as long as he has things to say and then says, "Okay, bye, Pop," without preamble and hangs up. Last Sunday, he told me Gerald chewed through a library book about volcanoes and he thought that was pretty funny. I told him it was pretty funny. It was. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. More time than I expected, honestly. You think something like this resolves and then you move on, but it doesn't quite work that way. It stays with you, not in a crushing way, more like a stone in your pocket. You carry it, and eventually you stop noticing the weight, but it's still there. What I keep coming back to is cause and effect, not in any mystical sense, just the plain, practical truth that what we choose to do and what we choose not to do produces results in the world. Renee made choices, small ones at first, probably. A rationalization here, a justification there. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to harm their child in a single clean decision. It happens in increments, each one feeling smaller than it is, until you've traveled so far from where you started that you can't see the beginning anymore. And then the results arrive. They always do. Not as punishment from anywhere outside yourself, just as the natural, inevitable consequence of the path you walked. Danny didn't choose any of it. That's the part that stays with me. He was 7 years old, and his only job was to be a kid, and instead he was spending his energy figuring out how to tell his grandfather something was wrong without knowing if he'd be believed. That's not a burden a child should carry. And the fact that he carried it anyway, quietly, carefully, waiting for the right moment, tells you something about who Danny is. There's a kind of intelligence in that, not book intelligence, something older and harder to teach. He assessed the situation. He identified who was safe. He chose his moment, and then he spoke. I think about that a lot when people ask me what the lesson is supposed to be here. I don't think there's one clean lesson. Life doesn't package itself that way. But if I had to say something, if I had to point to the thing that made the difference, it's that Danny had enough trust in one adult to take the risk of telling the truth. And I had enough sense to sit still and listen when he did. That's it. That's the whole thing. We spent a lot of time as older people thinking we're supposed to have answers. Wisdom, they call it. Experience. But I don't think Danny needed my wisdom that afternoon at the kitchen table. He needed me to keep my face calm and my mouth closed long enough for him to finish his sentence. He needed me to not explain it away. He needed me to believe him before I had any proof. The hardest kind of courage isn't the dramatic kind. It's not running into a burning building. It's a 7-year-old boy leaning across a kitchen table and deciding, against all the instincts that tell children to stay quiet and not cause trouble, to say the thing out loud anyway. Kevin is doing well. Danny is doing well. Gerald the dog chews through approximately 1 book per month and shows no remorse. And I drive out there on Saturdays when I can, and we build things in the garage, and Danny asks questions about every tool I pick up, and sometimes he puts a scrap of wood in his pocket and calls it a rock. I let him. Every single time I let him. Because the best thing I ever did for that boy wasn't driving him to the doctor, or calling Kevin, or sitting in that waiting room. The best thing I ever did was decide, a long time before any of this happened, to be the kind of person he felt safe enough to talk to. That's not something you do in a moment. That's something you build slowly over years of showing up, of listening, of not dismissing the small things so that when the big thing comes, they already know the answer to the question they're trying to ask. Be that person for someone. Start before you think you need to.